most people misunderstand about awakened empaths is that staying home isn't loneliness. It's survival. The world was not built for people who feel everything. Every crowded room is a symphony of unspoken pain. Every conversation carries invisible weight that most people never notice. But an empath absorbs it all, whether they want to or not. You've been told you're too sensitive, too withdrawn, too much. But here's what nobody says out loud. When you can feel the anxiety of a stranger across the room, when you leave a simple gathering and suddenly carry grief that isn't yours, going home isn't running away. It's the most intelligent thing you can do. The empath who chooses solitude isn't broken. They are highly attuned. And silence? Silence is the only place where they can finally hear themselves again, separate from the noise, the energy, the emotional residue of a world in constant chaos. This isn't about fear of people. This is about protection of self. And once you understand that, everything changes. Let's talk about something that most people get completely wrong about empath. When someone says, I feel you, they usually mean it as a figure of speech, a polite way of saying, I understand, I relate, I hear you. But for an empath, feeling someone is not a metaphor. It is not symbolic, it is not poetic, it is literal, it is physical, it is happening inside their body whether they chose it or not. This is the part people miss entirely. There is a fundamental difference between understanding someone's pain and actually carrying it. Most people can walk into a room, notice that someone seems upset, process that information, and move on. Their nervous system stays regulated. Their emotional baseline remains intact. They observed something, they noted it, and they continued with their day. An empath cannot do that, not because they are weak, not because they haven't learned to cope, but because their entire neurological and emotional wiring works differently. When an empath walks into a room where someone is grieving, something in their chest shifts. When they sit next to someone who is anxious, their own heart rate changes. When they have a conversation with someone who is silently angry, they leave that conversation feeling the anger without always knowing where it came from or why it now belongs to them. This is not imagination, this is not drama. Scientists have actually studied a specific type of neuron in the human brain called mirror neurons. These neurons are responsible for empathy at a basic level. They fire when you experience something, and they also fire when you simply witness someone else experiencing the same thing. In most people, these neurons create connection and understanding. In empaths, researchers believe this mirroring system is significantly more activated, more sensitive, more porous. The line between what is mine and what is yours becomes genuinely blurred at a neurological level. So imagine living inside that experience every single day. You wake up feeling fine. You step outside and take public transport. By the time you arrive at your destination, you are carrying the exhaustion of the man who hasn't slept in 3 days. The quiet devastation of the woman who just received terrible news. The restless agitation of the teenager who feels invisible at school. You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't even speak to any of these people, but your system picked it up the way a sponge picks up water, automatically, silently, completely. Now add to that a full day of work, of social interactions, of people venting, complaining, performing happiness, hiding sadness, leaking tension through every word and gesture. An empath doesn't just hear what you say. They feel what you didn't say. They sense the emotion living beneath the surface of your words, and their nervous system responds to that hidden layer, as though it were their own lived experience. This is why by the time an empath comes home, they are not simply tired, they are saturated. They are carrying an entire day's worth of emotional data that was never theirs to begin with, and their mind and body are completely overwhelmed trying to process all of it at once. People look at an empath who cancels plans, who leaves early, who doesn't respond to messages for a while, who needs an entire day alone after a busy weekend, and they make assumptions. They think the empath is antisocial, avoidant, maybe even rude. But what they are not seeing is the invisible weight the empath walked in with and the invisible work it takes to put it all down again. Think about it this way. If someone spent their entire day physically carrying other people's belongings, their bags, their boxes, their heavy coats, you would understand why they need to sit down when they get home. You would understand why they can immediately pick up something else. You would see the exhaustion because it would be visible. But when the weight is emotional, when it is energetic, when it exists in a dimension that most people don't even register, suddenly that same exhaustion becomes invisible. And invisible exhaustion is the kind the world has the least patience for. Here is what makes this even more complex. Empaths don't always know in the moment what is happening to them. They don't always have the clarity to say, wait, this sadness isn't mine. This irritability came from that conversation earlier. This anxious feeling is not about my life. It belongs to someone else, and I absorbed it without realizing. That kind of awareness takes deep inner work, time, and a very specific type of emotional intelligence to develop. And even when an empath does develop it, the absorption doesn't stop. It never fully stops, because this isn't a habit they can break. It is the way they are built. The work isn't about stopping the feeling. The work is about learning to recognize what is theirs and finding a way to release what is not. And that release requires something very specific. It requires quiet. It requires stillness. It requires an environment with no new emotional input coming in, so the system can finally begin to sort through what it accumulated and slowly, carefully put things back where they belong. This is what home represents for an awakened empath. Not a hiding place, not a retreat from life, but a clearing station, a place where the noise finally stops and the real work of separation begins. The work of asking, what am I actually feeling right now? What is genuinely mine? And what did I pick up along the way that I need to consciously let go of? This process is not quick. It doesn't happen in 30 minutes. Sometimes it takes an entire evening, sometimes a full day, sometimes longer, depending on the intensity of what the empath moved through. And the people around them who don't feel things this way will almost never fully understand why that much time is needed. Because from the outside, it looks like the empath is just sitting at home, doing nothing. They are not doing nothing. They are doing the hardest possible thing. They are untangling themselves from the emotional world of everyone they encountered and finding their way back to themselves. There is also another layer to this that very few people talk about. It is not just the negative emotions that drain an empath, it is all of it: excitement, joy, high energy, celebration. A room full of people having the best time of their lives can be just as overwhelming as a room full of tension. Because it is not the emotion itself that exhausts the empath, it is the volume. It is the constant influx of external feeling that their system has to process and absorb and carry. This is why an empath can attend a beautiful event, something they genuinely wanted to be at, something they actually enjoyed, and still come home completely depleted. People around them are confused. You looked like you were having fun. You seemed happy. Why are you so tired? And the empath struggles to explain because they were having fun. They were happy. And it still cost them something enormous. Understanding this changes the entire conversation about why empaths need solitude. It is not a preference. It is not a personality quirk. It is a genuine, non-negotiable biological and emotional need that is directly tied to how their system functions. Denying an empath consistent time alone is like denying anyone else basic rest. Eventually, something breaks. Awakened empaths understand this about themselves, not because they gave up on people, but because they finally stopped apologizing for the way they are wired. They stopped trying to keep up with a world that was not designed for the depth of their sensitivity. They stopped measuring their worth by how much social interaction they could tolerate. And they started honoring the truth that to be fully present for others when it matters most, they must first be ruthlessly present for themselves. The empath who knows how to come home, be still, and return to themselves is not the weakest person in the room. They are the one who has mastered something most people never will: the ability to feel everything and still choose not to be destroyed by it. There is a word that gets misused constantly when people talk about empaths who withdraw, who go quiet, who disappear into their own space for days at a time. That word is avoidance. And it is almost always wrong. Avoidance is running from something out of fear. Avoidance is refusing to deal with reality. Avoidance is building walls because you don't trust yourself to handle what's on the other side. But when an awakened empath steps back from the world, when they close the door, turn off the notifications, and choose the stillness of their own space over the noise of everything outside, that is not avoidance. That is one of the most conscious, deliberate, and intelligent acts of self-care a deeply feeling person can perform. The distinction matters enormously, because as long as people frame an empath's need for solitude as a problem to fix, they will keep pressuring them to stay longer, engage more, push through it, and in doing so, they will keep pushing them further away from the very thing that keeps them whole. To understand why staying home is an act of preservation and not escape, you have to first understand what happens to an empath's inner world after prolonged exposure to other people's energy. Think of the human nervous system like a body of water. For most people, social interaction creates ripples. Waves come in, move through the water, and eventually settle. The surface returns to calm relatively quickly. Life continues. But for an empath, those ripples don't settle on their own. Every interaction, every unspoken emotion detected, every energetic undercurrent absorbed adds another layer of disturbance to the water. And without deliberate, intentional stillness, the surface never returns to calm. It just keeps moving, getting choppier, more turbulent, more difficult to see through. This turbulence has a name. It is called emotional overload, and it is far more serious than people acknowledge. When an empath reaches emotional overload, they don't just feel tired, their thinking becomes foggy. Their sense of personal identity starts to blur. They struggle to locate their own feelings underneath all the feelings they have absorbed from others. Simple decisions become surprisingly difficult. Conversations that would normally feel easy start to feel like enormous effort. The entire system, mind, body, and spirit, is sending one clear signal: stop taking things in. You need to process what is already here. Staying home is the answer to that signal. It is the empath listening to their own body with the same seriousness that a person with a physical illness listens to a doctor who says you need rest. Nobody questions the person who stays in bed with a fever. Nobody calls them antisocial for not attending dinner when their body is fighting an infection. But an empath who says, I need to stay home, I need quiet, I need space to recalibrate, is often met with confusion, guilt trips, or the quiet accusation that something must be wrong with them socially. What's wrong is not the empath. What's wrong is the assumption that everyone processes the world the same way. Everyone does not. And the empath who has awakened to their own nature understands this truth deeply enough to stop apologizing for it. Now let's talk about what actually happens during that time alone, because this is where the real misunderstanding lives. People imagine the empath sitting at home doing nothing, wasting time, hiding. But inside that quiet space, an extraordinary internal process is taking place. The first thing that happens when an empath enters genuine solitude is that the input finally stops. No new emotions coming in, no new energy to absorb, no conversations to navigate or undercurrents to detect. And in that absence of input, the nervous system begins to exhale, slowly at first. Then more deeply, the body physically releases tension that it had been holding without even realizing. The shoulders drop, the chest softens, the breath becomes fuller. This is not laziness. This is the beginning of recovery. Then comes the sorting. This is perhaps the most important part of the process and the one that requires the most energy. The empath begins, consciously or unconsciously, to separate what belongs to them from what they collected along the way. That heaviness in their chest, is that theirs, or did they pick it up from a colleague who is quietly falling apart? That low-grade irritability lingering from the afternoon, was that their own frustration, or did they absorb it from someone they sat next to during lunch? That sadness that arrived without a clear reason, did it come from inside, or did they walk past someone on the street who was silently devastated and carry that person's grief home without knowing? This sorting process is not simple. It requires a level of self-awareness that most people never have to develop because most people don't need it. But for an empath, it is essential. Because an empath who cannot sort what is theirs from what belongs to others will eventually lose track of themselves entirely. They will start to believe that all of this heaviness is simply who they are, that they are a naturally sad person, a naturally anxious person, a person who is always tired for no reason. And that belief, if left unchallenged, becomes its own form of suffering. Solitude is what makes the sorting possible. In the quiet, the empath can finally hear their own signal clearly, separate from all the interference. They can ask themselves honestly, what am I actually feeling right now? And the answer that comes back is their own, not borrowed, not absorbed, genuinely theirs. Once that clarity returns, something else begins to happen. The empath starts to reconnect with their own energy, their own desires, their own sense of peace. Not the peace of a world that stopped demanding things from them, but the deeper peace of knowing themselves again, of feeling where they begin and where the rest of the world ends. That boundary, that clear internal sense of I am here and everything else is out there, is one of the most important things an empath can possess. And it is one of the first things that disappears when they go too long without solitude. This is why awakened empaths don't treat their time alone as a luxury. They treat it as a necessity in the same category as sleep, food, and water. Not because they are fragile, not because they can't handle the world, but because they understand that without this regular return to stillness, they cannot function at the level they are capable of. They cannot show up fully for the people they love. They cannot access their intuition clearly. They cannot create, contribute, or connect with any real depth. Everything becomes surface level and mechanical when the inner world is overloaded and never given time to clear. There is also something profound that happens in solitude that goes beyond recovery. In the quiet, the empath often experiences their clearest thinking, their deepest creativity, their most meaningful insights. This is because when the noise of external emotion is removed, their own inner world becomes vividly accessible. Ideas surface, patterns become visible. Emotions that needed space to be fully felt and understood finally get that space. Describe their alone time not just as rest, but as the most alive they feel, the most truly themselves. Not performing, not managing, not absorbing, just being. And that experience of being fully themselves is not something they can find in a crowded room or a busy schedule or a social calendar filled to the edges. It lives specifically in the quiet, in the home, in the space that the world does not enter unless invited. So when an awakened empath chooses to stay home instead of going out, when they leave an event earlier than expected, when they take an entire weekend for themselves without explanation, they are not pulling away from life. They are pulling toward themselves. They are doing the quiet, invisible, deeply necessary work of returning to who they are beneath everything they feel. And a person who knows how to return to themselves, no matter how far they have drifted, is never truly lost. Somewhere along the way, the world decided that sensitivity was a flaw. That feeling things deeply was a sign of weakness. That the person who cries easily, who needs more time to recover, who gets overwhelmed in loud spaces, who picks up on things others never notice, was somehow less equipped for life than the person who moves through everything untouched. This is one of the most damaging lies our culture ever agreed to tell. And it is a lie that most empaths spend years, sometimes decades, believing about themselves. Because when you grow up being told that you are too much, too sensitive, too emotional, too intense, you start to internalize that message as truth. You start to believe that the way you experience the world is a problem, that your depth is a defect, that what makes you different makes you lesser. And you spend enormous amounts of energy trying to be something else, trying to feel less, react less, notice less, trying to build a version of yourself that fits more comfortably into a world that was never designed with you in mind. But here is what that world never told you. What it perhaps never even understood itself. Sensitivity is not the absence of strength. It is a different kind of strength entirely, and in many ways, it is a far more sophisticated one. To understand this, you have to step back and look at what heightened emotional perception actually is at its core. When an empath walks into a room and immediately senses that something is wrong before a single word has been spoken, that is not weakness. That is an advanced form of information processing. Their nervous system is detecting microsignals, subtle shifts in body language, tone, energy, and emotional atmosphere that the average person's awareness simply does not register. They are reading layers of reality that most people don't even know exist. Think about what that means in real terms. While someone else is hearing the words being said, the empath is simultaneously hearing the words, reading the emotion beneath the words, sensing the intention behind the emotion, and feeling the impact of all of it in their own body in real time. They are processing multiple dimensions of human experience simultaneously, without training, without tools, without even choosing to. It happens automatically because their perceptual system is built for depth in a way that most people simply is not. Now ask yourself honestly, does that sound like weakness to you? The reason it gets labeled as weakness is because our culture measures strength in very specific and very narrow ways. Strength is loud. Strength is unbothered. Strength pushes through without slowing down. Strength does not cry in the car on the way home. Strength does not need a day to recover from a difficult conversation. Strength does not feel other people's pain as though it were its own. By those measurements, yes, the empath appears to fall short, but those measurements are incomplete. They account for a very particular type of resilience while completely ignoring the kind of inner capacity it takes to feel everything and keep showing up. To carry emotional weight that was never yours and still find a way to function. To remain open in a world that gives you every reason to close down. That is not fragility dressed up as something else. That is a form of endurance that is genuinely rare. The problem is that sensitivity without understanding is overwhelming. And this is the crucial point that most conversations about empaths misses entirely. When a person with heightened emotional perception grows up in an environment that does not recognize or validate their experience, they have no framework for understanding what is happening to them. They don't know why they feel so much more than everyone around them. They don't know why certain places drain them completely. They don't know why they absorb other people's moods without consent. And without that understanding, the sensitivity doesn't feel like a gift, it feels like a curse. A child who is extraordinarily gifted musically but never given access to an instrument or a teacher doesn't experience their gift as something beautiful. They experience it as a restlessness they cannot explain, an inner world they cannot express, an ache for something they cannot name. The gift is real. But without the right context and support, it creates confusion and pain rather than clarity and purpose. This is precisely what happens to empaths who grow up without language for what they are. The sensitivity is real, the perception is real, the depth is real. But because no one around them reflects it back as something valid, as something that makes sense, as something that has value, they are left to conclude that they are simply broken. That they feel too much because something in them failed to develop properly. That everyone else somehow learned to handle life and they missed that lesson. They didn't miss anything. They were given a different kind of awareness, and the world simply did not have the vocabulary to explain it to them. This is what awakening actually means for an empath. It is not a mystical event. It is not a sudden transformation. It is the moment when a deeply sensitive person finally encounters the right information, the right perspective, or the right reflection of themselves that allows them to say, this is what I am. This is why I experience the world this way, and it is not a mistake. That moment of recognition is often described as simultaneously one of the most relieving and most heartbreaking experiences of a person's life. Relieving because the years of self-doubt suddenly have an explanation. Heartbreaking because they realize how long they spent fighting against a nature that was never the enemy. And once that awakening happens, everything has to be rebuilt. The stories they told themselves about being broken have to be dismantled one by one. The habits they developed to suppress their sensitivity have to be examined and slowly released. The relationships and environments that only ever reinforced the idea that they were too much have to be evaluated honestly. It is a process, it is not quick, and it is not comfortable. But it leads somewhere essential. It leads to the understanding that their emotional perception is not something to be managed or minimized or apologized for. It is something to be understood, developed, and ultimately honored as one of their greatest capacities. Because here is the truth that the world's narrow definition of strength has always obscured. The empath who has fully awakened to their nature is extraordinarily capable in ways that are increasingly rare and increasingly needed. Their ability to read a room, to sense what someone actually needs beneath what they are saying, to hold space for pain without flinching, to detect dishonesty not through logic but through feeling, to connect with another human being at a level that goes far beneath surface conversation. These are not small things. These are the qualities that make the most transformative teachers, healers, leaders, creatives, and human beings. Not because empaths are special in a way that sets them above others, but because they access a dimension of human experience that most people move through their entire lives never touching. They feel the parts of life that others skip past. They stay in the difficult emotional spaces that most people exit as quickly as possible. And in that staying, in that willingness to fully inhabit the depth of human experience, they develop a kind of wisdom that cannot be learned from a book or a course or a carefully planned life strategy. It is learned through feeling, through absorbing, through surviving the weight of it and coming out the other side with a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. The world was not built for people like this. That part is true. The pace is wrong. The noise is wrong. The constant demand for productivity and performance and emotional availability on command is wrong for a nervous system as finely tuned as an empath. But that is not an indictment of the empath. That is a limitation of the world. And a world that mistakes depth for weakness has simply not yet learned to recognize what depth is worth. The most powerful thing an empath can do is stop seeing themselves through the eyes of a world that never had the capacity to understand them, and start seeing themselves clearly for exactly what they are. Not too much, but more than most people ever learn to become. There is a moment that almost every empath knows intimately, even if they have never had the words to describe it. It happens after a long day, after a difficult conversation, after a gathering that pulled them in too many emotional directions at once. They finally close the door behind them, and for just a second, everything goes quiet. And in that quiet, they don't feel relieved immediately. They feel strange, unfamiliar to themselves. Like they have been wearing someone else's clothes all day and forgot what their own body feels like underneath. That strangeness is not coincidence, it is information. It is the empath's inner world sending a very specific signal. You have drifted. You are carrying things that are not yours. Come back! And coming back is exactly what solitude makes possible. Most people think of alone time as simply the absence of other people, a gap in the social calendar, a quiet evening that happens because nothing else was planned. But for an empath, solitude is not a gap, it is a destination. It is a deliberate, necessary return to something that gets lost every single time they step fully into the world and open themselves to the emotional currents moving through it. What gets lost is the self, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, through the accumulation of every absorbed emotion, every detected undercurrent, every unspoken feeling they picked up and carried without realizing. By the end of a full day of living in the world, an empath is rarely entirely themselves. They are a mixture, a blend of who they are and fragments of everyone they encountered. And the longer they go without solitude, the more diluted their own signal becomes until they can barely locate it at all. This is not a metaphor. This is a lived experience that empaths describe with remarkable consistency. The feeling of not knowing what they actually want because they have been so attuned to what everyone around them wants. The feeling of not knowing how they actually feel because their emotional landscape has been so thoroughly populated with other people's feelings. The feeling of reaching inward for themselves and finding something blurred and indistinct where clarity used to live. Solitude is what dissolves that blur. When the external input finally stops, when there are no more emotions to detect and no more energy to navigate, the borrowed material begins to lift. Not immediately. The process is rarely instant. But gradually, layer by layer, what does not belong to the empath starts to release. The tension that was not their tension softens. The sadness that was not their sadness begins to lose its grip. The residual anxiety from someone else's unspoken fear slowly loses its hold on their nervous system, and as all of that lifts, something underneath it starts to become visible again. Something quieter, something more consistent, something that was always there, waiting beneath the weight of everything collected throughout the day. That something is the empath's own emotional truth, and reconnecting with it is not a passive experience. It requires a particular kind of attention. Not the outward attention that empaths are so accustomed to giving, the constant reading and sensing and feeling of everything around them, but a different direction of awareness entirely. Inward, slow, patient, asking not what does this person need or what is happening in this room, but what am I actually feeling right now? What is genuinely mine in this moment? For many empaths, especially those who have spent years prioritizing the emotional worlds of others over their own, this inward turn can feel almost foreign at first. Because they are so practiced at looking outward, so trained by years of absorbing and responding, that looking inward and finding their own emotional truth requires real effort, real discipline, a conscious decision to stop listening to everything outside and start listening to the one voice they most consistently neglect, their own. This is one of the deepest gifts that solitude offers the empath, not just rest from the world, but practice in the art of self-recognition. Every hour spent in genuine stillness is an hour spent relearning what they actually feel, what they actually think, what they actually need, separate from the needs and feelings of everyone they love and everyone they encounter. And over time, that practice builds something invaluable. It builds a stronger, clearer, more reliable sense of inner identity, a self that is easier to locate, easier to return to, less easily lost in the first place. There is also something that happens in solitude that goes beyond emotional clearing and self-reconnection, something that is harder to explain but equally real. In the deep quiet, when the empath has finally shed what was not theirs and returned to themselves, there is often a quality of presence that emerges that feels unlike anything available in the noise of daily life. A stillness that is not empty but full. A silence that does not feel like absence but like arrival. In that space, many empaths report experiencing their most honest emotions. The grief they didn't have room to feel while they were busy holding space for someone else's. The joy that got crowded out by the anxiety they absorbed in a difficult meeting. The longing, the inspiration, the quiet contentment that lives underneath all the noise but never gets a chance to surface until the noise finally stops. These are not small experiences. They are the emotional life of the empath, the real one, underneath everything else. And without regular solitude, that real emotional life never fully gets lived. It stays buried beneath layers of what was absorbed, expressed only in fragments, never given the full space and attention it deserves. This is why empaths who consistently deny themselves solitude often develop a particular kind of inner ache that is difficult to name. It is not depression exactly, though it can look like it. It is not loneliness exactly, though it can feel like it. It is more like a persistent sense of disconnection from themselves. A feeling of being present in their own life but somehow not inhabiting it fully. Of going through the motions of existing without ever quite arriving inside their own experience. That ache is the self, calling out to be returned to. And the answer is always the same: come home. Not just to a physical space, though the physical space matters, but to the interior home. The inner landscape that is uniquely, irreducibly theirs. The place where no one else's emotions live. Where the only feelings present are the ones that genuinely belong to them. where they can finally exhale completely and exist just for a while without the weight of the entire emotional world pressing in from every direction. For awakened empaths, this understanding changes the way they relate to their own need for solitude. It stops being something they feel guilty about. It stops being something they have to justify or explain or apologize for. It becomes something they protect with intention. Something they schedule with the same seriousness as others schedule meals or exercise or sleep, not as an indulgence, not as a luxury, but as the foundation without which everything else in their life becomes harder, shallower, and less sustainable. Because the empath who is regularly returned to themselves is a fundamentally different presence than the empath who is perpetually overloaded and self-lost. They listen more clearly. They love more fully. They create more authentically. They contribute from a place of genuine abundance rather than quiet depletion. They can feel deeply without drowning. They can be present for others without disappearing from themselves. They can move through the world with all the sensitivity that defines them and still know exactly where they are inside it. Solitude is not where the empath hides from the world. It is where they remember who they are well enough to return to it. And an empath who knows how to find their way back to themselves, no matter how far the world pulls them, can never truly be taken from the one place that will always be most sacred to them. The quiet, unshakable truth of their own inner home. There is a particular kind of pain that lives quietly inside almost every empath who is not yet fully awakened to their own nature. It is not loud pain. It is not the kind that announces itself clearly or demands immediate attention. It is the slow, persistent ache of someone who has spent years feeling guilty for needing what they need. Someone who has looked at their own requirements for stillness, for space, for solitude, and decided, almost without realizing it, that those needs make them selfish. That every hour spent alone is an hour taken away from someone who deserved their presence. That their sensitivity is a burden they are constantly inflicting on others by not being able to simply push through it the way everyone else seems to. That guilt is not truth, but it feels like truth. And for a deeply feeling person, the difference between something that feels true and something that actually is true can take years to untangle. The guilt usually starts early. It starts in the moments when a young empath needed to leave a family gathering because the emotional noise became unbearable and saw the disappointment on someone's face. It starts in the friendships where they cancelled plans because they had nothing left to give and felt the quiet withdrawal of someone who took it personally. It starts in the relationships where a partner looked at their need for alone time and interpreted it as rejection, as distance, as a sign that something was wrong between them rather than a sign that something essential was being honoured within the empath. Over time, all of those moments accumulate into a story. And the story says that needing space is the same as being unavailable, that protecting your energy is the same as being selfish, that choosing yourself is the same as abandoning everyone else. And because empaths feel the impact of their choices on others so acutely, because they can sense disappointment and hurt and confusion with a sensitivity most people don't possess, that story becomes extraordinarily difficult to challenge. Every time they try to honour their own needs, they feel the weight of how it lands on the people around them. And that weight often becomes heavier than the weight of simply suppressing the need and pushing through. So they push through, again and again. They stay longer than they should. They show up when they have nothing left. They give from empty. And they tell themselves that this is what love looks like, that this is what being a good friend, a good partner, a good family member requires. But there is something no one tells them in those moments. You cannot pour from an empty vessel, not sustainably, not without cost. And the cost accumulates in ways that are invisible at first, but become undeniable over time. The empath who never honors their own need for stillness becomes increasingly depleted. Their sensitivity, which is their greatest asset, begins to feel like their greatest enemy. Their capacity for deep connection, the very thing that makes them so valuable to the people in their lives, begins to erode. They start showing up as a diminished version of themselves, present in body, but absent in the depth that makes their presence meaningful. And the cruel irony is that in trying to be everything for everyone, in sacrificing their own needs to avoid the guilt of appearing selfish, they end up giving less, not more, less of their true self, less of their genuine attention, less of the real depth that only becomes available when they are resourced, restored, and returned to themselves. This is the paradox that awakening reveals. Protecting your energy is not selfishness, it is the prerequisite for genuine generosity. But understanding this intellectually and actually living it are two very different things. Because the guilt doesn't disappear the moment you recognize it. It has roots, deep ones, roots that were planted by every well-meaning person who ever made an empath feel that their sensitivity was inconvenient. Every environment that rewarded self-sacrifice and equated personal needs with weakness. Every relationship that was only comfortable with the empath when the empath was giving, and grew uncomfortable the moment the empath turned inward and said, "Right now, I need to take care of myself." Releasing that guilt is not a single decision, it is a practice. It is the daily, sometimes hourly, work of catching the moment when the old story resurfaces, recognizing it for what it is, and consciously choosing a different response. It is learning to sit with the discomfort of disappointing someone and not immediately moving to fix it. It is developing the capacity to feel someone's hurt without immediately taking responsibility for managing it. It is recognizing that other people's reactions to your boundaries are not always a measure of whether those boundaries were right. This is some of the hardest work an empath will ever do. Not because they don't understand it conceptually, but because their entire perceptual system is wired to feel the impact of their choices on others. Choosing themselves will always feel like it costs something, and for a long time that cost will feel unjustifiable. The practice is learning to justify it anyway. Not through indifference to others, but through a deepening commitment to the understanding that their well-being is not separate from their ability to show up for the people they love, is the very foundation of it. Awakening for an empath is largely the process of building this understanding into something solid enough to stand on when the guilt comes. And it will come. Even after years of conscious work, there will be moments when the old voice returns, the voice that says you should be there, you should be available, you should be giving more than you are. The difference is that an awakened empath has developed the inner stability to hear that voice without immediately obeying it, to examine it, to ask where it came from and whether it serves them. And most importantly, to remember what happens when they don't honor their own needs, not as punishment, but as evidence. Evidence that their solitude is not selfish, it is sacred. Because what lives on the other side of that guilt, what becomes available when an empath finally stops apologizing for what they need and starts protecting it with intention, is something remarkable. It is a quality of energy that cannot be faked and cannot be forced. It is the presence of someone who is genuinely full, who has returned to themselves completely, who is showing up not out of obligation or guilt or the fear of disappointing someone, but out of real, renewable, authentic care. That quality of presence is felt. People feel it even when they cannot name it. There is a difference between being with someone who is running on empty and being with someone who arrived full, and that difference is not subtle. The empath who has learned to protect their energy, who has done the difficult work of releasing the guilt around their own needs, becomes more powerful in their connections, not less. They become more honest, more present, more capable of genuine intimacy because they are no longer performing care while quietly disappearing beneath the surface of it. They are actually there, fully, cleanly, with the depth that their sensitivity makes possible and the sustainability that their self-care makes real. Their sensitivity becomes finally what it was always meant to be. Not a wound they are managing, not a burden they are endlessly apologizing for, but a gift they are now strong enough to offer. Something that flows outward from a place of genuine abundance, rooted in the knowledge that they have honored themselves enough to have something real to give. This is what it means to truly awaken as an empath, not to stop feeling, not to stop caring, not to build walls or harden the heart or become someone who needs nothing, but to arrive at the unshakable understanding that your sensitivity is not the problem. The guilt around honoring it was. And the moment you lay that guilt down, you stop shrinking to fit a world that misunderstood you and start expanding into the full extraordinary capacity of everything you were always meant to be. Your sensitivity was never the thing that made you too much. It was always the thing that made you more than enough. And protecting it is the most courageous act of love you will ever perform. For yourself and for everyone, your depth has the power to touch.